three of the organizations. One is the Arnold Bergstrasser Award of 2012, then Cecil B. Curry Award of 2013 from the Association of Third World Studies, and then Gisela Born Award 2013 from the German Indo Society. It's a great pleasure that I am present at an event where three institutions have come forward and awarded a very recently done book. I had the pleasure of meeting him how many? 6-7 years earlier. In 2006 he came and he queried and questioned me on regionalism. Very kind of him to have sent me a notice after his book was published. And it's a great pleasure that I have this privilege of joining you. He studied at the University of Freiburg and is also lecturing there these days. He is also a fellow of Arnold Bergstrasser Institute for Socio-Cultural Research in Freiburg, Germany. And his main interest is India's foreign policy. And obviously the book is on regionalism, so I understand he would map out regionalism and assess India's foreign policy on that basis. I haven't read the book. As I said, he did inform me that his book is out. I'll surely have a very soon occasion to read the book. But his conclusion is very firm, that the regionalism where India got involved have not succeeded. And he's dealing with 4 regions. SAARC is one, BIMSTEC is another, Ganga Mekong is yet another, and Indian Ocean Rim is the 4th one. Not all regional initiatives have been, very, very deeply driven by India. Some of them, not all of them. In fact, when I did an article decades back on SAARC, I titled it as Regionalism from Below. And I put 2 categories of regionalism. Regionalisms in the world which are induced and encouraged from outside, and regionalisms in the world which come out of the initiatives of the countries of the region themselves. Generally, every region or sub-region claims that the regionalism initiative is theirs, but not really, not in most of the cases. And in my first book, I even discussed that Bangladesh initiative, which fructified into SAARC, was also to some extent, in many ways, induced from outside. We will see, this is a matter of debate. I don't want to raise it here. But let us listen to him and see how India's policy has failed these regions and has not succeeded because of or on account of these regionalisms.
Thank you, Professor Mooney, for this very kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, before I start, I would like to thank the ISAS, one of the leading research institutes on South Asia in the world. It is really a great pleasure that you are hosting me today, and I would especially like to thank Mr. Mizan Ramat for, in a way, initializing my talk today. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I want to tell you a tale of 4 organizations. And I have structured my book talk as follows. I will first of all look at the idea and the relevance of the topic. Why regional multilateralism and what is regional multilateralism? And then I want to briefly look at global governance and worldwide regional multilateralist activities, because this is of great importance for the whole book. And then as the second point, I just have 2 slides really about India's foreign policy. This is my field of specialization, and I teach this at the University of Freiburg for 1 semester. So here I will dedicate maybe 1 minute to this, so please allow me to be very, very brief. I cannot do justice, but it's very important for the whole proceeding of the book. And then number 3 and 4 are the actual case studies. For organizations, we are all experts on acronyms, really, the SARC, the IORC, the BIMSTEC, the MGC, we have the ACD and the ASROC. All of these organizations or initiatives are very important for the whole main argument of the book. And then finally, conclusions about the future of regional organization, and then hopefully we'll have a very lively question and answer session. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that this whole body of regional multilateralism is under-researched and also underestimated to a certain extent. Professor Mooney has written many, many interesting books and articles, especially on the SARC. But once you leave the South Asian region and move to the Bay of Bengal or to the Indian Ocean, the body of work really shrinks. So what I was trying to do, I wanted to write a book that has 2 different approaches. You can just take this book and read it as a history book. If you're not a political scientist and you don't think that the kind of theoretical approach which the book has is either applicable or appeals to your sense of what say, a theory should do, then you can just skip the theory part and just read the book as a mere history book about the genesis, the evolution, and the status quo of organizations. However, if you're willing to follow me on this theoretical path, so to speak, I invite you now for the next 4 slides just to follow me for a, let's call it, thought experiment, just a theoretical model. What I'm trying to prove, what I'm trying to argue is there is a certain Asian way of looking at regional cooperation. And comparable to a burning glass, these 2 citations, which I have here behind me, in a way shed light on what all this is about. Nehru said very succinctly, there is an Asian way of looking at the world. It's different from the Europe-centered world. It's just something that is very peculiar to the Asian region. So in a way, this is exemplary for what the book wants to argue. And then Sonia Gandhi, about 10 years ago now, she said, there is no alternative to working in concert and collaboration. And I find this also very important for the whole book, coming from the highest echelon of politics in India, these 2 very different citations. So one, let's say, slide about the whole approach that I use. Ladies and gentlemen, in international relations, you have norms. You have a norm, for example, of collective security. You have a norm about the banning of chemical weapons. You have a norm against the banning of landmines. All different kinds of international norms, which are then implemented either through international organizations or through local bodies. The kind of model that I'm using is I define an international norm by the name of regional multilateralism. And I have 13 different points. If you will, it's a matrix of analysis. The first point that you see here, this is just like the definition. And when you read the book, you find 13 points which make up this definition. And I'm using these 13 points for all 4 organizations, so you can do a comparative case study. And you can ask yourself, there is a paradigm of regional multilateralism. The European Union fulfills that paradigm 100%. But what about the Asian organizations? How do they compare when you look at this regional multilateralist definition or matrix? And the way I'm approaching this is called norm localization. So you have an international norm, and this is being localized to a very specific geographic setting. I had the pleasure of going to the Asian Civilizations Museum 2 days ago. And just there, in the very first entrance hall, what you see is a sign that says, this is about the localization of religion, of ideas coming from, for example, South Asia to Southeast Asia. So what this book does, it tries to answer the question, is there an international norm that has been localized to a specific South Asian Indian setting? It's just a model, but it helps very much so that you can compare the European Union, for example, with these 4 other organizations, or for that respect, any other organization in the world. So regional multilateralism is sort of a thought construct. It's a soft benchmark, which allows you to compare and to eventually see how have these organizations developed. And this is really all I want to say about this whole theory approach, because I, in this presentation, want to focus on the genesis and historical aspect. The question maybe about methodology and fieldwork. I'm using an approach which is called process tracing. Process tracing is an historical account that looks at the stages of development of certain events, in this case the organizations. And I conducted fieldwork, and Professor Moni already pointed this out some years ago. I interviewed about 60 decision takers in New Delhi, in Shimla, in Kathmandu, also in Heidelberg, which is the major South Asia center in Germany. I was denied a research visa for Pakistan. I wanted to fly to Pakistan also, but I couldn't go there. So I'm basing my argument on secondary sources. And as far as interview partners are concerned, besides the, say, academic elite, such as Professor Moni, I was able to interview former Indian Prime Minister who just passed away, I.K. Gujaral, former SARC secretaries, former MEA secretaries, members of the Rajya Sabha, the academia, and also at the SARC headquarters. So I was trying to get a very, very broad picture of what regional multilateralism, the way I define it, is really all about. So, this is the theme of the book and the theoretical approach. Now, as far as the relevance of the topic is concerned, obviously the nation state still plays the major role in the world. There's no doubt about it. However, in the global governance arena, what you also have are international organizations such as the United Nations that play a very important role. You have global civil society, important NGOs such as Greenpeace, for example. You still have a very important local political aspect. And then you have regional spheres. Here I've written regional integration spheres. You don't have to believe in this kind of idea that it's really integration, but you do have regional spheres. The most important, the most influential one, without any doubt, is the European Union. It is the organization, the regional organization, which is worldwide known and which has the most impact on anybody living in the confines of the European Union. Interestingly, just in January last year, there was an article on CNN, actually on the CNN homepage, by two Harvard professors. And they said, regional multilateralism is the next paradigm in global affairs. It's a very interesting article, you can read it on the web. And I defined regional multilateralism many, many years ago, so I was quite interested to see, and quite happy really, that they also use this term of regional multilateralism and say with all these problems in the world, everything cross-border, the only possible solution, the only real solution, is a regional solution. And therefore everything that has a multilateral regional aspect is really the right approach. Also, the EU received the Nobel Prize for Peace, which is not a mean achievement if you think that there is an international organization receiving the Nobel Prize for Peace. The interesting question would be, is that possible for the South Asian context? Will the SARC ever receive the Nobel Prize for Peace? Of course, I argue against this, and the reasons I'm trying to come up with in this book. And then, needless to say, Obama and Clinton, they called the America's Pacific Century and the Asia Pivot, shifting the focus of the United States on this region of the world. And then the question is for the United States, and for India also, how do you engage? Do you engage bilaterally, or do you engage multilaterally? And when we now look at the world, it's a world of regions. What NAFTA is doing now is practically what the European Union did in the 1960s. And NAFTA and the three countries that are its members don't want to do anything else. They're happy with the free trade agreement. This is what the North American continent is most likely to look like. The European Union is expanding and it's cooperating horizontally, vertically. It's getting stronger and stronger. Of course, this is debatable as far as the euro is concerned. But the European Union is a major player in global governance. And then you have all these other organizations, or arrangements, or initiatives. And with my book, and I think this is actually the first book of this kind, I shift the focus on these four organizations, which are South Asia, and then to the left and to the right. And really look at the question, how did they develop, and what is the status quo? And I think this is high time that this is done, looking at the importance of India for the world, and also of the region for the United States and the European Union. And this leads me to the last slide of my brief introduction, the puzzle and the research questions. And I think that these four citations really shed light on what the problem is. For example, in 2005, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh said, the honest answer is that after 20 years, regional economic cooperation in South Asia has fallen far short of our expectations and the dreams of our founding fathers. It remains far behind the more successful examples in both Asia. A citation comparable to this you can find at every summit that SAARC has. The Minister of Foreign Affairs of Myanmar, Nguyen Win, said, there has been a general perception that despite 7 years of efforts by MGC countries, there has been very slow progress. The World Bank, in a very well-noted study in 2007, said, South Asia is the least integrated region in the world. And then Shashi Tharoor, in his very brief stint as Indian Minister of External Affairs, he actually traveled to Mauritius for one of the meetings of the Indian Ocean Rim. And what he said, very succinctly, after 12 years of cooperation, this organization has not done enough to get beyond the declaratory phase that marks most new initiatives. So none of these organizations really seem to work. And the puzzle is, why is it that regional cooperation in these areas, in these geographic expanses, just does not function? And my book is one approach, one soft approach, if you will, based on a constructivist reading that provides answer in that respect. Now, as I said, for the whole proceeding of the book, I have to make clear what is India's foreign policy. So my book looks very briefly at the major stages of India's foreign policy, starting also with some pronunciations by the Indian National Congress, and then of course from 1947 until today, milestones in the evolution, and then raises the question, what really does India stand for? And for a book that uses a localization approach, that says an international norm is really transferred, or is transformed in the region, you must know what the regional determinants are. So one must know what is India's foreign policy really, before you can say that India is transforming an international norm. Once again, it's a thought, like a thought product. So you can ask the question, has there been a shift from Nehruvian idealism towards this post-1991 pragmatism? Is there a dualism of these two? Does India follow double standards? And does India have contradictory foreign policy objectives? And is there maybe a clear rift between rhetoric for cooperation and then the reality? And at the end of the second chapter, I come up with this, the mind of India's foreign policy. What I argue is that India's foreign policy really has, when you do a discourse analysis, for example, 12 major features. And these major features are responsible for transforming international norms into the Asian, into the South Asian context. And for me, very important are the Panchil principles. This is mine here. You're all familiar with the Panchil principles, and it's very interesting to note that as general principles, they have all found their way in all of the founding documents of the organizations. Now, Nehru said the idea of the Panchil means everybody, every country fends for itself, and there will be no interference by one country in the affairs of another country, which of course is the whole idea of complete freedom of action and thought for India, needless to say. And this chapter then raises the question, if this is really what India stands for, how has this been transferred into the local context? And therefore the case studies, chapters 3 and chapter 4. And the first question is, maybe most of you know, the first attempts at regional cooperation already started in 1947 with the Asian Relations Conference. There was this talk of, we must cooperate. We independent countries must come up in the Asian context with something new, some institutions. And I very briefly touch upon 8 different conferences and attempts of discussing problems. And the most important one here is number 5, the Bandung Conference. And here I asked, why is there no NATO? Or in other words, why is there no collective security in South Asia? And the answer is very simple to be found in Nehru's complete rejection of all kind of collective security attempts. So let's say collective security stands for political cooperation between countries and for security cooperation, which is very important for the South Asian context. And this rejection of everything related to collective security goes until 1961. So in this part of the book, I just try to answer the question, what happened between 1947 and the beginning of the actual processes of regional cooperation. And surprisingly, after 1961, nothing has happened. While the European Union, or the European Community as it was called then, was really starting to take up speed, in 1961 in the South Asian region, there was no more activity. There were some think tanks who were putting out papers, but there was no political activity. So until 1978, you don't have any kind of cooperation, any kind of attempt even. And then what you have is the coming into being of the SARC. And you're all aware of the member countries here. And I'm using this slide once again because it's very interesting to see how membership in one organization also finds itself again as membership in the other organization. But for the time being, let us just focus on the SARC. The SARC has received its own logo. The SARC has a homepage, which is also very important to keep in mind. And it has these countries, and Afghanistan was the last one to join. Now, the original vision goes back to 1978-79. There was a letter written by Bangladesh. It was sent to heads of state and government, and they said, we must, in this region of the world, cooperate. However, there was a certain vision that Bangladesh had, and this vision was we want to have extensive regional cooperation. We want to have as many fields as possible. And from 1978 to 1985, there was this process of negotiation. And eventually, in 1985, the SARC, with the first summit, was founded, and the charter incorporated certain principles. The Panchita principles, but also no contentious bilateral issues were allowed to be discussed. First there were 7 members, now we have 8. A headquarters to be located in Kathmandu, the Secretary General of the SARC Secretariat, and now you have 8 observer countries. Now, as a scientist, if you want to write about an organization, how do you go about? Well, I suppose you try to follow historic evolution, which is, it's a bit difficult for all of these organizations because so little really has happened. Until 1985, there's this incredible body of articles and books about finally we have regional cooperation here in South Asia. And then after the SARC summit, and I just want to really throw this at you here, until now you have had 17 summits. So you can do a historic account of SARC by looking at what happened between the individual summits. In the charter it says a summit once a year. Now clearly this hasn't happened, and the last summit, the 18th, has been deferred, which is not uncommon in the SARC context. It's still at large. So Nepal is supposed to host the next summit, and it's not taking place. But we have had, give or take, only about half of the summits that we should have had, which is a very sad thing to really acknowledge. And then when you look, and this is of course taken from my book, at the way this organization works, what you see is sort of a minimal level of institutionalization. You have summits, but only 17 so far. You have the Council of Ministers, the COM meeting, and you have a standing committee. And then you have ministerial meetings. But this really is all that the SARC is made of. And as this book is a comparative study, I use the same kind of, let's say, tables and figures to compare all 4 organizations. And it is my argument that really one of the major birth defects has to be seen in this institutional structure, which does not allow for any kind of institutional independent evolution. Nothing really can be expected from an organization that has such a low level of cooperation. And in my university classes, in one of the beginning sessions, I always ask my students, how many pages is the acquis communautaire made up of? The acquis communautaire, as probably also all of you know, is the body of legislation that the European Union is being made up of. Does anybody know here, if I may ask a question? How many pages did Croatia have to transfer into national law now that it joined as the 28th member country? Would anyone like to take an educated guess? What is the acquis communautaire in the European Union? How many pages?
80,000?
Yeah. 80,000 pages is what the European Union has achieved, you can have a question mark, is what is required. Every country that wants to join the European Union has to implement into national law 80,000 pages, ranging from economics to culture to security. Everything, 80,000. Now, SARC has this, and I did a count. These are the conventions and agreements. So this is the body of, well, it's the acquis communautaire of SARC, I suppose you can say, and this is about 40 pages. Which is not, I'm not trying to ridicule this, but when you want to really see what SARC has achieved, when you look at the conventions and agreements, and when you really want to ask, or when you really have to ask, how have these conventions and agreements been treated in national law, you see that sometimes there was a gap of 5 years before countries actually implemented these into the national legislation. The question why? Difficult to answer. So then, as a summary of the SARC, what has it achieved? It does have a headquarters, which is a very important first step. It does have a Secretary General. There are these summits, and there are these conventions and agreements. With a question mark here, there is a SARC identity, with a very big question mark. There are certain SARC centers all over South Asia, but they are staffed to a very limited degree. Sometimes they have one woman, one man working there. Interestingly enough, there is now the South Asian University. It just came into being last year as a postgraduate university in New Delhi it will be. So this could really be interesting for the educational side. Most importantly, I spoke about NAFTA for the North American market. Now SAFTA is in force since 2006. But the actual exchange in goods has been, and this is the latest statistic, $2 billion. $2 billion within the frame of SAFTA. Now $2 billion is practically nothing. When you look at SARC, which is the largest regional organization population-wise in the world, 1.5 billion people. And they have an inter-exchange of SAFTA, of about 2 billion. So there's really quite some achievement possible. One of Germany's leading historians on South Asia, Dietmar Rothermund, he wrote the standard book on India's foreign policy from a historical perspective. I interviewed him also, and he said for him, he has been following SARC for the last 30 years. The only achievement, which is a very important achievement, is behind the doors discussion between India and Pakistan and the heads of state and government. So whenever there was one of these summits, there was this potential, this possibility of meeting and of talking. It is an achievement, but then again, it's a small achievement. And then, of course, when you ask, does SARC have any geostrategic relevance? Can anything be discussed really, or can anything be solved? When you look at all these inter-border problems in the South Asian region, the answer is a definitive no, it doesn't work. Kashmir has never been discussed. It's not supposed to be discussed. So when you read this book until then, you do get an impression of how India changed this international norm, and I'm not going to use this slide now because it's too much information on one small slide. It used regional multilateralism, but in these stages of negotiations, it made sure that only certain minimal features were actually transferred into the South Asian context. And this is a book that wants to compare. This is a book that argues it's always the same kind of pattern. And therefore, the next step is look at a different organization. And the next organization, which I analyze, and there is surprisingly little written about the book, about the organization, is the Indian Ocean Rim Organization Association for Regional Cooperation. And I use the same approach. I ask what has been achieved in the Indian Ocean before the organization came into being. So in this chapter, I look at 1971 until 1997, and I try to come up with an answer to, has anything really been achieved in the Indian Ocean Rim in terms of institutionalized cooperation? And the answer is a very simple no, nothing really. And when you ask, what is the largest regional organization in the world? One answer is, it's the SARC, for the population. And the other answer is, it's the Indian Ocean Rim Association for the geography. I'm sure you have never seen an organization that stretches from South Africa all the way to Iran, all the way down to Australia. It is really by far the largest organization one can imagine. And here we go. Let's compare. How did everything go about? There was, once again, negotiation stages, which were started first by South Africa and then by Australia. Eventually, India took the reins of the organization of the negotiations in her hands. That's the result of my empirical research. And the organization, when it was founded in 1997, it didn't look at all like the organization which South Africa and Australia had actually in mind, because they wanted to have a security, economically based organization which would allow for a free trade area, which would have all these different sectors of cooperation. It did not happen. There are now 19 member countries. There are 6 dialogue partners. There are so-called priority sectors, and I name all of these in the book. From India, there is now a Secretary General who is based in Mauritius. And between 1997 and today, you only had 12 so-called Council of Ministers meetings. You never had a summit. There was never the heads of state and government meeting and discussing. There has always been only been the Council of Ministers. And surprisingly, India insisted that Pakistan would not be allowed into the organization. Sometimes when you read about SARC, you hear there's the Pakistan factor. The SARC hasn't taken off because Pakistan is responsible. Since we are comparing, take out Pakistan in the Indian Ocean Rim, so supposedly with India as one of the major protagonists, the organization should work much better. In reality, it doesn't. It follows a very, very specific kind of institutional setup. I'm afraid this, maybe you can read this. You have 3 pillars. You have a business pillar, you have a trade and investment pillar, and you have the so-called academic group pillar. And these are the main institutional bodies of the organization besides the Council of Ministers. So once again, what you have is a level of cooperation at the lowest level possible, so to speak. And once again, I would like to use Shashi Tharoor, who said, the organization is lean to the point of emaciation with just half a dozen staff, including the gardener. I can't put it any better. So you have like 6 or 7 people working for the largest regional organization in the world, who has an institutional setup that just doesn't work. Originally, this secretariat, which is now in Mauritius, and which is funded also by Mauritius, was called Pilot Mechanism. It wasn't called Secretariat, it was called Pilot Mechanism. The 3 pillars that I showed to you, this is called the tripartite approach. And it follows APEC. APEC is much more successful, so this organization wanted to emulate, but didn't work. Australia has pretty much withdrawn. It's still officially a member, but it's not active. And in my book, which goes until 2012, I also cite the last Council of Ministers meeting. And there, one of the last sentences is, we want to change the name of the organization because apparently the name has not found international acknowledgement, which I found a very strange thing. After 15 years of cooperation, you suggest we have to change the name of the organization. So, this was the second organization, and now I can be brief. When I look at the third organization, which has another very fascinating acronym called BIMSTEC, which is the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical Economic Cooperation. When you look at the membership, what you see at first glance is it's SARC minus Pakistan and the Maldives, plus Thailand and Burma. So you have 2 organizations, South Asia, Bay of Bengal, which have the exact kind of membership, minus Pakistan, plus Thailand. And you would suppose that there is a certain overlap in terms of priority sectors, in terms of dialogue. And BIMSTEC is really a fascinating organization because practically nothing has happened there. Comparing it to the SARC and the Indian Ocean Rim, negotiation stages, 3 years, initiated by Thailand. The original vision by Thailand, we want to have the Bay of Bengal Union comparable to the European Union. We want to have politics and economics as major parts. We want to have a large free trade area. Incidentally, the name was first BISTEC and then was changed to BIMSTEC. It was founded in 1997. And it took a whopping 14 years of discussions before a secretariat was eventually founded. And so now in Dakar, since last year, 2 years ago, we have a permanent institution. If you're interested in information about the BIMSTEC, I can only invite you to, of course, take a look at the book, which should be available in the library here, but you will not find a homepage. BIMSTEC does not exist in the internet. When you type in BIMSTEC into Google, what you find is an entry on the homepage of the Thailand Ministry, I think it's called, of External Affairs, which is just like, it has the founding document. But there is no homepage, which is really surprising in our times and age, really surprising. What we can say is a BIMSTEC free trade area has been planned, has not been implemented, even though think about the limitless possibilities. How much economic exchange could you have in the Bay of Bengal? There have been only 2 summits so far, which is when BIMSTEC looks a bit like this. You have summits, originally each year, but instead of 14, you only had 2 so far. You have a foreign ministers meeting You have now a secretariat, and you have a trade and economic ministers meetings. And then you have some smaller level, let's say, institutions. But nothing that resembles any kind of a real working institution. Interestingly, when I interviewed Raja Mohan, he was actually very much in favor of BIMSTEC. He said, you know, SARC is unlikely to take off. There's always the Kashmir problem between India and Pakistan, but the BIMSTEC does have this potential. The BIMSTEC has the economic potential, and it also has the political potential. So BIMSTEC could be the next big thing for India's foreign policy. I mean, this is from 2004, and you find some more citations in my book, but unfortunately, BIMSTEC has not been like the big regional organization for the South Asian plus Bay of Bengal context. What it hasn't achieved is also this thing of competing regionalism. So maybe you can pressure one organization which has the same membership if it doesn't work. This was an idea which also didn't really work. What you can say is BIMSTEC has been looked upon as the next big thing in India's foreign policy, but really it hasn't materialized. And then finally, we have the Mekong-Ganga cooperation. Now, I'm not an expert on, let's say, river geography in South Asia, but I believe that the Ganges does not stop at Indian borders. It also goes into Bangladesh. But surprisingly, Bangladesh is not part of this organization. Bangladesh is part of a different organization, which is called the BCIM. But here, India wanted to sort of cooperate, or actually, India was asked to cooperate with these 4 countries on the other side, 5 countries. And as this is the final case study, the same pattern. It was initiated by Thailand. Thailand said, now since the whole BIMSTEC doesn't work, can't we just cooperate just with you, India, and with the other countries of this Mekong, of the Mekong River, one of the major rivers for us? Extensive regional multilateralism was the idea. The result was India said, we are not interested in any kind of deep cooperation. We have a certain interest in cooperating with you culturally. So what you have is an organization, actually it's called an initiative only, that has met 6 times only now. But there was an article in Frontline which said that the MGC is the next level in India's foreign policy, because here it is that India can form a bloc against China if India treats the organization correctly. I think that was a bit premature, because really this organization is practically non-existent. You might have seen on the slides, the SARC, the BIMSTEC, and the Indian Ocean Rim, they have logos, at least, as an organization. The Mekong-Ganga has no homepage, has no logo. It exists somewhere in cyberspace. And there was just a meeting a few weeks ago when there was an ASEAN meeting, because the idea was, every time ASEAN meets, the countries of the Mekong-Ganga cooperation also meet. It hasn't happened. China has started the Kunming initiative, and there's also a Thai initiative, another initiative, which I'm not going into. So you have like 3 different initiatives in this region, and the MGC is the one that hasn't really taken off. This is the lowest level of institutionalization. You have annual ministerial meetings in consonance with ASEAN, which didn't work. So to conclude, one more thing very interesting. You have 2 dialogue organizations. One is called the Asia Cooperation Dialogue, which was founded in 2002. And just allow me to read two sentences here. The Asia Cooperation Dialogue was founded by Thailand, and Thailand said the ACD is a continent-wide forum, the first of its kind in Asia. It aims to constitute the missing link in Asia by incorporating every Asian country and building an Asian community. Key principle is to consolidate Asian strength. The core values of ACD are, etc., positive thinking, non-institutionalization, openness, comfort level of member countries. Now, the ACD was meant to be the largest Asian organization ever to be founded, and interestingly enough, nothing has been achieved in this organization. It exists as one homepage, and apart from that, it has 32 members, the latest one being Afghanistan. And what it does, the ACD lists the SARC and the BIMSTEC as members. which I find extremely interesting, because both organizations do not have an independent actor quality, such as the European Union. The European Union can speak for itself, but SAARC and BIMSTEC can't. So how can these two organizations be listed in the ACD? It beats me.
But they're listed as SAARC and BIMSTEC member countries, not as SAARC and BIMSTEC organizations.
The way it's framed there, they say SAARC is one of our organizations. But we'll come to that. So then my conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, if you follow my localization approach, what you see is that you have 4 organizations which overlap in membership and which overlap in sectors of priority. I use the term Panchil multilateralism. Coming back to what Nehru said in my initial slide, what is an Asian way of cooperating? Maybe it is Panchil multilateralism, which means it is a very, very low level of institutionalization with an ensuing kind of low level of activity. What you have here is you always have a recurring pattern in the initial negotiations. The original initiator, in a way, was sidelined, the original visions thwarted. All 4 organizations or initiatives are completely under-institutionalized, under-financed and understaffed. What is necessary in my perspective, and that's the last part in my book also, is a paradigm shift for cooperation in the region. If India, as the major protagonist, is really interested in strengthening regional cooperation, they must be willing to implement something along the lines of the European Union, which is the supranational approach. They must take certain projects and put it above the level of intergovernmentalism, so that you have an independent work between the member countries, above the member countries. And these 7 points is what I end my book on. What should be done as policy recommendations besides a supranational approach? You must have lots more money given to the organizations. You must have lots more staff working for the organizations. And you must have common projects and common visions in order to have a common objective towards which the organizations will eventually work. And I would like to end with this quote by Nehru. Once again, he said, "I venture to submit that Asia counts in world affairs. Tomorrow it will count much more than today," which I think is it's a true fact. Even though with a caveat in terms of regional cooperation, as I term it, for the sake of argument, regional multilateralism, Asia has not yet achieved its full potential. Thank you very much.